Um, Welcome everybody. Here I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. I don't know if that was eminently clear to everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. So I'm sitting here in Jerusalem. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here. I know it's depending upon where you are in the US or in Canada, you're anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 or before that. I don't know. But here it's evening time. So maybe another 30 seconds about, not 30 seconds, 5 seconds about myself. You can hear an American accent. I made Aliyah. This September will be, no, next month it'll be 40 years. I'm made in the US, but from age 18 forward, I've been living in Israel. And I've been doing Israel education for much of those 40 years. So without further ado, just for your information, as we speak right now, and so I'm looking at my camera looking at you, but I really want to be looking at my news feed because right now the Israeli Supreme Court is sitting on a very interesting case, which is the question of whether or not the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, should be incapacitated, meaning a law was passed in March, which was an amendment to a basic law, which basically said that unless the Prime Minister is mentally or physically incapacitated, he cannot be removed from his place. And if he is removed, it's going to be done by the Parliament, Knesset. Well, there was a challenge to that, and the Supreme Court is sitting on the challenge today. And it's very, very interesting because this is a basic law. So stay tuned. And there are also demonstrations taking place as I speak right now in Jerusalem, outside the Supreme Court. So this is what's happening right now. Now, I'm sure that everybody's aware that for the last 31 weeks in a row, in short term, that means about 7.5 months, we've been having demonstrations in Israel on a weekly basis, in some cases bi and tri-weekly. And at least within 1 week, we had about 600,000 people out there demonstrating. So this is something huge. And I'm sure all of you are aware of the fact that Israel is in a very significant inflection point right now. And I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have maybe been on podcasts, you've read a lot of articles, and so on and so forth. And most of the podcasts and most of the articles, I think, are focusing on the nitty-gritty of what is this legal reform about, okay? And going to a lot of legalese, and those of us who don't have a legal background, so it may sound gibberish to us, but what I'd like to do today, and I will go into some of the legal aspects because it's all about that, I want to talk about something else, which is how did we get to this moment? Probably a lot of you have been to Israel last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, everything was great. How did we get to a situation where people are talking about a potential civil war? We have thousands of reservists who are not showing up for duty, and we have like crazy things happening today. And I want to bring us up to date. And I want to look at it. I want to take a zoom out and take an historic view of this. Go back 75 years and understand what is the groundwork, okay, that we have that brought us to this moment. I want to take the long view, and then I want to take the short view of why now. What happened in the last 9 months, 8 months, 7 months that brought us to this point as well. And then, of course, we will go into the nitty-gritty and talk about who's for, who's against, and, of course, where this might be going. So without further ado, Adi, if you can put up the presentation. So, yeah, and let's go forward. Go ahead, Adi. Let's take a look at what's been going on. This is something that I filmed in real time. Keep going, Adi. And next slide. Anyway, I want to show you some footage of different things we've been seeing in the last few months. Let's see one more now. Adi, another one.
אנחנו, דור העתיד של המדינה הזאת, לא מוכנים לתת לאף אחד להרוס את הדמוקרטיה הישראלית ולהרוס את העתיד המשותף שלנו כאן, ביחד, דתיים וחילונים, שמאלנים וימנים, מזרחים ואשכנזים.
Okay, let's stop here for a moment. This is a demonstration that took place outside the Knesset. You can't tell, but in the lower left-hand side behind this video screen, that you can see the edge of the Knesset, Israel's legislature. The young man, boy, teenager who's talking is wearing a kippah. He, in Israeli terms, he's modern Orthodox. And what he's saying is, it's not about right, it's not about left. It's not about religious. It's not about secular. It's not about Mizrahi. It's not about Ashkenazi. So he's talking about who is opposing this reform. And this is a very interesting statement, which we're going to have to wrap our heads around. But I want to say something of clarity right now, which I think is very, very important. This story is definitely not the Israeli right versus the Israeli left, because the protesters are comprised and composed of people from the center, people from the left, people from the right. We have religious people there, and we have secular people. Those who are for the judicial reform actually are all from the right. Some of them are secular, some of them are religious. So it's a bit more of a mixed bag than would meet the eye. Adi, keep going forward. Next slide, please. This is something I took last week. This is the day, the 24th of July, when the first piece of legislation actually passed. And this is several hours later, about 4.5 hours after the legislation passed. And what you're seeing here, if it's not clear, is that the police were using water cannons to disperse the crowds, and I had to drag my intrepid wife out of the way. I don't do that kind of stuff, but she did. I had to drag her back so she didn't get hit with a water cannon. And in fact, to be honest with you, out in the field, we're seeing that the police are getting, how should I say, a bit more aggressive. Adi? So let's stop for a moment here and look at the very, very basic timeline, okay, just so we can get some kind of time framework. And then, as I said, we're going to go back in time and we're going to look at what brought us to this moment. So as you can see here, very end of December last year, the new government takes its seat, and 6 days later, on the 4th of January, the newly minted Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, is going to table the judicial reform, and it's like he dropped a bomb on Israeli society. It's very important to understand that the Likud party, from which he comes, did not present this reform in their campaign. In fact, virtually none of the parties that won, that formed the government, campaigned on the reform. So this is actually quite a shock to Israeli society. And 3 days later, we have the first small demonstration, okay? That's on the 7th of January. Then what we have a week and a half later, the Supreme Court is actually going to void the appointment of a senior minister in the newly minted government, Rabbi Aryeh Deri, and we'll talk about why that's the case. They basically said this can't be under something known as the doctrine of reasonableness, and we're going to talk about what that's all about. Not to worry, okay? And within another 3 days, you're going to have the first massive demonstration of over 100,000 Israelis out in the streets and demonstrating. Just to contextualize again for literally 1 second, the Israeli population today is 9.8 million citizens, 9.8 million citizens. So when you have 100,000 people demonstrating, that's a very large percentage. It's a very large number, okay, when you think it in those terms. Please, Adi, let's move forward. So who is going to introduce the judicial reform? We have the two gentlemen you see in front of you. On the left, you have Member of Parliament Simcha Rotman, who is also from the Religious Zionism Party, which is a settler party, very right-wing religious nationalist party. He also got the position of being the chairman of the Knesset Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, which actually is a committee that can table a bill. In terms of passing law in Israel, you can have a member of parliament can do what's called a private bill. You can have a committee, as Simcha Rotman is the head of this committee, can actually table a committee bill, and you can have the government itself can table a bill. In this case, what we have is Rotman is going to table this. Yair Levin on the right-hand side is the Minister of Justice who announced the judicial reform. So this is our starting point. Adi? So I said I'm going to explain the judicial reform, but I'm going to do that more towards the end. Here, I'm just going to lay out very, very briefly what it's all about, very, very briefly, and later on, I'll go into a higher resolution. So those who are proposing a judicial reform are saying the following, that the way that Israel selects its justices to the Supreme Court is biased and flawed, okay? And the politicians need to be the ones to do it, and that's not the case today. The Supreme Court has excessive power over the legislature. In other words, the balance, the checks and balances of Israeli democracy have lost their balance. to the favor of the Supreme Court, and it has to be rebalanced. Okay, and government legal advisors, that means the Attorney General, state prosecutors, have way too much power. The Attorney General can actually send the Prime Minister for an indictment, which in fact is exactly what happened some 2.5 years ago when the Attorney General, who was appointed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the police basically handed him so much evidence that he had to push for 3 indictments against a standing prime minister who had appointed him. Okay, so and legal advisors can actually block sometimes government decisions if they are illegal or have a scent of corruption. Please. So what's on the table? What were they talking about in January? What are they talking about today as well? Number one, want to change the way that the Supreme Court justices are appointed. Number two, we want to change the way that judicial review works in the Supreme Court, in particular, to remove something known as the doctrine or standard of reasonableness. Want to legislate a law that will enable the Knesset, the legislature, to override a Supreme Court decision. If the Supreme Court decides something, this so-called override law, which doesn't exist today, can basically void a Supreme Court decision, and want to basically dramatically change the role and status of Attorney General, State Prosecutor, and so on and so forth. Adi? Okay, so some of the reactions, and you heard before in the video clips, but this is kind of creative, so I thought I would share it with you. Took a photo of this guy who had this, this is a bereavement notice, okay? And basically it says, with deep grief and sorrow, we are informing you of the passing away of our regime. Democracy, rest in peace. And you can see the rest of this. And the Shiva will take place in all of our homes on Route 2. And this is kind of interesting, the Caesar-Yahu dictatorship. So Caesar, and a lot of you have been to Caesarea, but Benjamin Netanyahu also has a private home in Caesarea. And here they combine Caesarea to Caesar-Yahu. So it's kind of an interesting play on words. Please, Adi. Here's some more interesting and creative stickers we've seen here. One of them is loyal to Israel's Declaration of Independence. The meaning being that Declaration of Independence is guaranteeing basic rights, democracy. Okay, and the other one here is basically saying this judicial reform is about Jewish supremacism, it's about racism, and it's about homophobia, and we're not accepting it here. I'm just sharing with you what some of the opposition to the reform has presented in the actual demonstrations themselves. Adi? Let's hear from somebody who actually is for the reform.
My name is Zehava. In English, it's Golda. I'm named after my great-grandmother. And we are here. We are few people, but we are really the majority in Israel that went on the voting day, and we wanted this government, and we want to have this revolution because it's really needed, because we are in a progress many years that the judges just take the law to their hands.
Okay, thank you, Adi. Please move forward. So I think it is important that everybody understands that while you're hearing all about protests, there are also people who are for it. So let's start now our beginning. I want to start with day one. Day one means the 14th of May.
Avi, can I just hop in really quickly, just from the chat, a point of clarification that you keep using the language of they table a bill, which in the United States means that they're pushing it to the side and they're not stopping it.
But I'm sorry, I apologize. Not table a bill. We're talking about presenting a bill in order to legislate a bill. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So now I'm going back. I'm taking us back to time now to talk about how we got to this moment. I think that's something that interests a lot of you, and it's very important for us to understand. And I'm beginning with Israel's Declaration of Independence, 14th of May, 1948. Okay, and what we can see here colored in yellow is that within the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, I warmly recommend that everybody at some point downloads and reads the whole text. It's a fascinating text. Here it says, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, known to be the state of, in other words, the Declaration of Independence does clarify that Israel is to be a Jewish state. Nowhere in the Declaration of Independence does it say that Israel is going to be a democracy. Adi, forward. Having said that, we take a look now at another part, continuation of the Declaration of Independence, and this does kind of give us a roadmap that the intent is for a democracy. Okay, and I would like to read this whole thing to you. We declare that with effect from the moment of the termination of the British mandate being tonight, into the establishment of an elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which shall be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly not later than the 1st of October, 1948. Let me reread that again. Declaration of Independence says that Israel is going to have a constitution 3.5 months after this declaration. Declaration is the 14th of May, and here there's a commitment to have a constitution by the 1st of October, 1948. Please go forward, Adi. Do we have a constitution? The answer is we do not. One more, Adi. So if we don't have a constitution, do we have a Bill of Rights? The answer is we do not. Why do we not have a constitution? Why do we not have a constitution? We do not have a constitution because at the time, and I'm talking about during the war, during that 3.5 month period, you had all kinds of opposition within the government and from outside the government to put together the Constitution. Most people like to quote the fact that the religious parties, whether we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox or the modern Orthodox, were opposed to it because they said, we have a constitution, it's called the Torah. That's true. But it also needs to be said that David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister, was also opposed to putting together a constitution. He thought it was too difficult. He wanted to have socialist aspects. He realized that many people would not agree to that. Basically, they kicked the can down the road. And now let's take a look at what was done instead of having a constitution. Adi? In 1950, we have something known as the Harari Resolution, declared in the Knesset. It's one more. Adi? And essentially, what this resolution says is the following. The Constitutional Law and Justice Committee is to create a whole set of basic laws, which you'll present to the Knesset, and the Knesset will pass. And these basic laws will be the building blocks of a constitution. And once they have all of these basic laws in place, they're going to declare a constitution. And they begin to legislate basic laws. And we have a whole slew of basic laws. The problem with the resolution is the following. Number one, the resolution itself does not explicitly give basic laws any kind of supremacy over regular laws. Number one. Number two, it doesn't say how many people you have to have just a majority vote for it. Does it have to be a supermajority? How about annulling it or amending it? Do you have to have just a majority or a supermajority? And maybe most importantly, it doesn't say explicitly that it's a constitution. Hold on to those thoughts because this is very important. Because the spoiler is the Knesset does not perceive the basic laws that have been passed as constitutional, but the Supreme Court does. And that already is an issue and a problem. Let's go forward. Adi, I want to just give you an example of one basic law. Okay, this one was passed, I would say, rather late in the game. It was passed in 1992, and it's called the Basic Law of Human Dignity and Freedom. And essentially, it's a very short law. You could go online and check it out later on. Basically, it is saying that every human being has dignity. You can't touch somebody without their agreement. You can't take their property. They have freedom of movement. Anybody can leave the country, can enter the country, and so on and so forth. It doesn't go into high resolution, but this law, which was actually brought by two members of the Knesset, one from the ruling Likud party, center-right party at the time, and one from the left at the time, they brought it together, was basically trying to enshrine human rights in the Israeli law code. And based on this law, the Supreme Court, a few short years later, ruled, for example, that torture is illegal in Israel. What I just said was, the Supreme Court actually created a law. It legislated based on this basic law. I'll get back to it later on, but this is considered one of the most important laws, and it's also on the agenda for maybe amending. So let's move forward, Adi. Israel's system of government, in contrast, and I don't want to assume where you folks are from, but I'm going to assume that you're either from US or Canada or Australia, just based on usual Melton audience, but maybe we have from other countries as well. Just for the clarity, I'm going to compare and contrast with the US system. The Israeli system of government is a parliamentary democracy. It's not a Republican presidency, and essentially, like any democracy, you have a division between the branches: the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch. Okay, and of course, in every democracy, you have to have a separation of powers and a system of checks and balances. Adi? Now, because Israel is a parliamentary democracy, what it means is the executive branch, the government, in order to function and in order to actually survive, has to have a majority of seats in the parliament. What this means in real terms is that there's no separation between the executive branch in Israel and the legislative branch. They sit together as one because the executive branch controls the legislative branch. And what that means is when we talk about Israel's system of separation of powers and checks and balances, it's not a triangle like it is in the United States, but rather it's 2 against 1. And some would make the argument that in order for these checks and balances to work properly, you'd have to have a strong judiciary because you actually have 2 powers together here, okay, operating facing the judiciary. Adi? So what kind of checks and balances do we find in other democracies that you do not find in Israel? So most democracies have bicameral legislation, which means 2 houses. The United States has both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they can check and balance each other. Okay, that's number one. The executive and legislative branches, okay, let's say in the United States, and just using the States as an example, can check and balance each other. The president can veto legislation, the Senate and the House of Representatives cannot confirm, and so on and so forth. There's no federal system in Israel. And what a federal system in the States looks like, and also in Canada, is that there's kind of a check and balance between the federal government and states' rights. And states can do things that sometimes push out government interference, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. You do not have that in Israel, okay? And there's no constitution in Israel. The Bill of Rights, by the way, Israel is one of 3 democracies that I know of that does not have a constitution and Bill of Rights. The other 2 are the UK and New Zealand, okay? But the UK, for example, has to listen to a constitutional court, which Israel does not have to do, okay? So that's important as well. Adi? And again, Israel, unicameral legislation, one legislature, the Knesset, no separation between the executive and legislative branches, no constitutional Bill of Rights, and no federal system, okay? So we don't have the basic checks and balances we have in virtually all the other democracies, which doesn't mean that Israel is not a democracy, but it means that the system of checks and balances is particularly weak in the Israeli system. Adi? And here we just have a comparison between the Israeli and American systems. US system is kind of a triangle, and the Israeli system is kind of a 2 against 1, as I mentioned. Let's move forward. But one of the big questions, and which appears to be kind of tertiary, but it's actually very, very much in the center, is the question of Israel, Jewish versus democratic attributes. Israel defines itself as a Jewish and democratic state, and it appears as though the judicial reform is kind of shaking the edifice that's standing behind this. Adi? Why bring religion into the issue? Well, no less than Member of Parliament Simcha Rotman, okay, the head of the Knesset Judiciary Committee, Constitutional Committee, basically is calling this a religious war. He said so in a U.S. newspaper. He didn't say it in an Israeli newspaper, but he said it in a New York newspaper in March of this year. Let's move forward. One of the heads of the opposition, one of the heads of the demonstrations, not the political opposition, but demonstrations, and she actually had a profile done in her 2 days ago in the New York Times. Professor Shikma Bressler, who is secular, as a nuclear physicist, basically talks about the fact that the governing coalition is talking about Jewish supremacy. Okay, but have I gone too far, Adi, in talking about religion and how it's integrated, Adi? Well, what does religion have to do with it? Let's take a look forward here. Here is a poster that I took a photograph of, and I've translated for you from the Hebrew into English. Okay, with God, it says in the corner, with God's help, demonstration They have been trampling on us for 40 years already, and they want to erase the Jewish character of the state. From now on, we will not be silent. This is a poster calling for pro-reform, pro-government demonstrators to go out in the streets. Adi? Well, when we scroll and take a look at comments that have been made very recently and in the last decade by major religious leaders and political leaders in the religious Zionist camp, and I'll just read one of them to you. You see them all in front of you. Israeli democracy has ended its role. It needs to be dismantled and to yield to Judaism. When you read all four quotes from four different people, one of whom is a member in the present coalition. By the way, the gentleman all to the far right, Avi Maoz, who was in the present coalition, is the head of a party. What is branded on the banner of that party? It is anti-conservative and reform Judaism. It is anti-LGBTQ rights. Okay, just so that's the main platforms on in this party. That the gentleman all the way up to the right, you see here, Avi Maoz. The bottom line is here we're talking about a desire, at least for these religious figures, for a theocracy, not a democracy. Adi? So, what I really want to say to you is that from day one, actually one day before day one, already from 1947, even before there's a state, there is a tension and a question about the Jewish character of the state. We all know what democratic means. The question is, what does a Jewish state mean, Adi? And essentially, I want to focus now on two issues very briefly. One is something known as the status quo, and the second one is the issue of the exemption from military service of certain religious groups. Adi? In 1947, before this estate, ultra-Orthodox religious leaders turned to Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Jewish Agency, soon to be new prime minister, and demanded all kinds of assurances that the state that will be established will have specific Jewish attributes, and they actually named what they are. And David Ben-Gurion sent them a letter in the name of the Jewish Agency, which basically said, when the state will be established, we will legislate the following: that Shabbat, Saturday, is going to be the day of rest in this country, not Sunday, the Christian day of rest, not Friday, the Muslim day of rest, but Shabbat, Saturday. Kosher food has to be provided in all public institutions. The religious authorities will have exclusive control over matters of marriage and divorce. Religious authorities, the meaning here is the chief rabbinate, the rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, not other rabbis from other streams of Judaism. And the government is going to commit to allowing the ultra-Orthodox to have an autonomous educational system. And the shorthand for that is they will not be required to study the core curriculum that the rest of the country has to study, meaning no math, very little math, no science, no English. Adi? By the way, within 5 years, Israel legislated all four of what you saw before. And then the question is, what about mandatory military service for all? Adi? Well, what's going to happen is in 1948, while the War for Independence is running, heads of the ultra-Orthodox community in, now it's Israel, will turn to Ben-Gurion and ask for an exemption for 400 yeshiva students. And Ben-Gurion said, you know what? Okay, 400 yeshiva students, we can deal with that. And essentially, that will jump to 800 by 1968. It was capped in 68 to 800. But then when Menachem Begin was prime minister, he actually removed the cap. And what's going to happen, as you can see here in the statistics, by 1999, you already had over 30,000 yeshiva students who basically were exempted from military service. Okay, by 2005, 42,000. By 2010, 62,000. Okay, you get the idea. By 2012, the Supreme Court basically said this is not fair. It's not fair in terms of equal rights on all, and turned to the government and said, you need to legislate one way or the other, because this is not legislating. This is just a practice. Okay, it wasn't law. And the government can function up and back, up and back. To date, right now, we have about 12,000 ultra-Orthodox per cohort. We have like 4 or 5 cohorts per year. Right now, about 1,000 out of that 12,000 get drafted, which means that it's less than 10% are actually being drafted into the army, and about half of them going to combat capacities, the other half are actually not. So this is an issue that has made people very, very angry in Israel. Adi? and is certainly central within the reforms. Now, there's something else we have to understand, and that is, and what I'm doing now is very schematic, and the truth is I'd have to add another maybe 3 or 4 people and ideas here, but I'm taking something that's generally accepted in Israel, that there are, let's say, 4 different visions for Israel as a state. We have the secular Jews who want a Jewish and democratic and liberal, modern liberal democracy. We have the national religious who want the Jewish aspect of Jewish democratic to be much, much stronger than the democratic, okay? And with a very, very strong emphasis on the sanctity of the entirety of the land of Israel, okay? And some of them, as we saw before, also talk about theocracy. We have the Israeli Arab population that constitute a little over 20% overall, 2 million people who want a democratic state, but they want no Jewish character to the state. And we have the ultra-Orthodox, who generally speaking want to self-segregate, but if they have their druthers, they'd like to have a theocracy, a state that's basically purely on halakha. These 4 visions don't exactly dovetail. And what we're finding ourselves now is that it's starting to fray at the seams. Adi? Now, in terms of what's going on with demonstrations and who are for and who are against, we have a very interesting proposal, not mine. It's actually the gentleman in the center, you see here, Dr. Michael Goodman, who makes the claim that there is an extreme left that doesn't want anything to be changed. No, they're completely against the reform. We have the extreme right that wants to go full blast, won't make any concessions. And he says that there's a middle mass of 65 to 70% of the Israelis who really agree on most things and want to work together consensually, and they're being dragged by the extremes down this road. This is his take. I just want to share that with you because I think it's important to know that that's out there. Not everybody accepts that that idea, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Adi? So there's another piece historically to understand what's happened here. We have something known as the Judicial Revolution. It was declared by then President of the Supreme Court, Justice Aaron Barak. He declared this in 1995. And essentially, in his so-called Judicial Revolution, he created a very activist court. He was in for many, many years, not as the Chief Justice, but he was in that court for many, many years. And basically, he said the following. And the most important thing he said was that the basic laws are actually a constitution. We have a constitution, okay? They have constitutional status, and we're going to rule based on that. That's number one. Number two, he said anything can be adjudicated, okay? Which means that the Israeli Supreme Court has more cases than any other Supreme Court on earth. That's a stat. That's not an opinion. Everybody has standing. A Palestinian who is not a citizen of Israel can challenge an Israeli government policy in Israel Supreme Court. And I mentioned this earlier, using judicial activism in certain cases, the Supreme Court is actually creating laws. And I gave the example of saying that torture is illegal based on a basic law of human dignity. That's not what the law says, but that was their interpretation and understanding, and they basically claimed a law there. Okay, Adi? Now, everything I told you is history. It's from 1948 until today. But if we take a look at how we get to this very moment, what's happened here? Well, let me look at some short-term catalysts. Number one, we're facing what everybody's facing around the world, and that is the echo chamber. We're all exposed to a lot of media. Everybody chooses the one that suits them, and we're all closing down and only listening to people that interest us. Second thing is, in November of last year, after 5 elections, we actually had the election of the most right-wing and most religious government in Israel's history. And finally, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, has legal woes, which we're going to explicate in a few moments. Let's move forward. Echo chamber, you know what it's all about. As I mentioned, a lot of different stimuli. Everybody chooses typically what interests them. And I just want to read this quote to you. The political discourse gradually, tell me if this resonates for you where you're sitting. Okay, maybe it doesn't. Okay, but the political discourse gradually turned crude, nasty, derogatory, and contentious. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. Adi? Most right-wing religious government ever. So when we take a look at the folks you have over here, Benjamin Netanyahu is the left-hand side of his government. Within his own party, half his party is now modern Orthodox and ultra nationalist. To his right, Bezalel Smotrich, the settler leader, wants a theocracy. To his right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a neo-Kahanist, follower of Meir Kahana, wants, 1 second, Adi, okay, also would like to have a theocracy. Aryeh Deri, Sephardic ultra-Orthodox, Moshe Gafni, Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. This is the face of the new government. As I said, the most right-wing and religious government in Israel's history. Adi? Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been indicted on 3 counts: bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He is now in the 3rd year of his trial, as has been going on, and this is a big problem. Please, Adi. So we talked about some of the arguments that move forward for the judicial reform. Let's talk about what's actually on Adi. Let's talk about what's on the table here. As we said, changing selection and appointment of Supreme Court justices, changing the role of judicial review, legislating override law, and changing the role of the Attorney General. Adi? So how does Israel choose its Supreme Court justice today? There is a 9-member committee. Please note, we have 2 ministers. They're from the ruling coalition. We have 3 justices based on, well, you have the Chief Justice and you have those who are following in terms of their age and how long they've been on the court. Okay, we have 2 members of the Bar Association that are chosen by the Bar Association. They're elected. And we have 2 members of parliament, 1 from the coalition and 1 from the opposition. That's, by the way, a tradition. It could be, doesn't have to be 1 from the opposition, but that's the way it's always been. So we have a 9-member committee. You have to have 7 out of 9 to agree on an appointment. What that means is the politicians can block an appointment and the justice can block the appointment. You have professionals here and you have politicians. In other words, this is considered by many political scientists to be one of the most apolitical and fair appointment systems in the democratic world. Adi, let's move this forward. I'm showing here one of the proposals. There have been several proposals of the coalition in terms of changing the composition. The bottom line is to ensure that the coalition can actually choose the justices. And the main idea here, my friends, is the government were elected by the people. They're representing the people. Therefore, they should be choosing the justices. That way, the justices represent the people. That is their major claim over here. Adi, let's move forward. Judicial review of the Supreme Court can void bills, laws, if they contradict the basic law. And this, in fact, has been done in the past. Okay, Adi, let's move forward. The solution to this is an override law. Passed an override law, basically the legislature, the Knesset, can strike down a Supreme Court decision. Adi? And it would be, they can actually do it with a simple majority. Adi. So I'm sure this has been jumping into your newsfeed over and over again, and you're probably scratching your heads if you're not lawyers. What the heck is this? There's something known as the doctrine of reasonableness or the standard of reasonableness. And essentially, this is a concept that was not invented in Israel. It's been used in Israel since the 1950s. It actually starts in the UK. It's used in UK, Australia, Canada, other democracies. And essentially, when you have a system based on common law that doesn't have strong administrative laws, Israel doesn't have them, this is a tool in the toolkit of the Supreme Court that enables them to monitor the government, that it doesn't make corrupt decisions or doesn't make decisions that go against human rights. Okay, and so I'm going to give you one example. When it hasn't been used very often, it has not been used very often, used very, very, very carefully, but I'm going to give you one example. 2007, rockets were being shot on Israel from Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The government decided they're going to spread around safe spaces, kind of mobile rooms around the schools so kids could run to them when they get a 15-second warning. The town of Sderot, which was in the receiving end of most of the rockets, which I'm sure most of you are aware of that, turned to the Supreme Court and said, this is not fair. Supreme Court ruled this is unreasonable and demanded and forced the government to actually fortify all the schools, that the schools themselves would be rocket proof. That's an example when the government used that. Adi, let's move forward. The second example took place, I mentioned earlier, March, when the government basically said, when the Supreme Court basically said the following: the government has appointed a twice convicted criminal, somebody who sat in jail, who in 2021, as Minister of the Interior, was caught evading taxes, signed a plea bargain, he would leave public service and he wouldn't go to jail. And he was appointed to 2 ministerial positions, okay? And basically the Supreme Court said, this is void, it's unreasonable. So this is what I'm using it. Adi, move forward. So what's the idea? The idea is to basically erase the standard of reasonableness, and this was done as an amendment to the basic law of the judiciary this past a week ago, Monday, on the 24th of July. Adi? Attorney General's decisions will only be regarded as advice and not be legally binding. Attorney General will not be allowed to indict or send a prime minister to be indicted. This is what happened with Netanyahu back in 2019. 2020. So you see, want to basically clip the wings of the legal advisors. Adi? Okay. Let's talk very, very, very briefly about the stake. Actually, you know what? My time is almost up. So I think I'm actually going to, let's pull this down. Adi? Let me come down to the people and see the people can see me and not that. And so let me just, I'm going to cut, I want to cut to the chase for a moment. We have a dichotomy in Israel between many Israelis, and I have to tell you that based on the public opinion surveys, it's the majority. All the public opinion surveys in Israel in the last 7 months have shown that between 60 and 70% of the Israelis are against this judicial reform, including, by the way, almost half the voters for Likud, which is the largest party in the ruling coalition. Okay, so this is going against the will of the people. This is very, very important to understand. As I mentioned before, it's the people who are opposing it are also, you have religious, you have secular, you have left, you have right, you have all kinds of people from different walks of life. The statistics are showing that between 20 and 22% of all Israelis have demonstrated at least once in the last 31 weeks. That's an insane percentage when you think about it. And that says a lot. And one last thing, and then I'll start dealing with the questions that have come in. It's very important for you to understand that this is a frightening inflection point. What may have not crossed your radars, the following 2 things, just put them out there. There's a WhatsApp group of 2,000 Israeli doctors, and the name of the group is called Relocation. They're looking to relocate from Israel. 2,000, that's in the news. Okay, that's one piece that you may not have heard of. And the other one is that several very, very senior nuclear scientists are leaving the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission because of the reform. So I just want to share that with you, just keep you up to date. And now I'm going to address the questions that have come into. Is that correct, Adi? The questions that come into the chat, or people?
Sure, we could do questions through the chat, or if people want to use the raise hand function.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with the chat. Is that okay? You tell me. Does that work?
Please go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Okay.
I'm also happy to pick some out if you can.
So the Knesset never signed on to the idea that basic laws taken together form a constitution, but the Supreme Court did. The answer is yes. The Supreme Court declared in the 1990s that the basic laws constitute, I'm sorry for the pun, constitute a constitution. Pardon my pun. Okay. The Knesset does not agree that the basic laws constitute it yet, despite the Harari resolution of 1950, where they said these are going to be the building blocks. The Knesset legislated that, but yes, that's the answer to the question. How is Israeli theocracy different from the mullahs of Iran? Let's wait and see. I don't know. I honestly can't. I can't answer that. But I will tell you something. Another thing in the news today. You know, the Knesset, the Parliament, went into summer recess 3 days ago, and evidently one of the ministers slipped under the wire legislation, which now people are losing their minds about, that there has to be gender separation in the national parks where there are springs. Yep. Okay. You asked about theocracy. Okay. Is Barak claiming for the Israeli Supreme Court the power of Marshall versus Marbury, where Marshall created the right of the Supreme Court to rule on constitutionality of laws for Israel? The Israeli Supreme Court ruled on yes, no for legislative executive acts. Wow, that was a very long question. The answer is 85% yes. In other words, let me say this clear to everybody here. Barak, Aaron Barak, who's no longer, who's now I don't know, 87, 88 years old. By the way, a Holocaust survivor. Part of what he was claiming about the right of the Supreme Court to rule on constitutional laws, okay, is based on an American decision, but it also has to be said that because the basic laws were really left in the amorphous state, it wasn't clarified. Do they have super status? Are they stronger or not? By the way, that one law that I told you about, that the basic law of human dignity and freedom, has a super status. It was legislated into the law that it has a super status. But the reality on the ground is it's the only one that has that. Okay, and all the rest of them don't necessarily have a super status, and you can amend them, and you can do it with a simple majority. And so this has been something up in the air for a long time. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court took a stand and said, this is actually a constitution, okay, as per a legislative resolution in 1950. And Supreme Court, the Knesset didn't agree with it, but kind of played along when it wanted to and didn't play along with it when it didn't want to. Okay, if the Knesset oversees the Supreme Court, aren't the foxes watching the hen house? Well, does the Knesset oversee the Supreme Court? At this very moment, it doesn't. I mean, to this moment, it doesn't. But those who are against this judicial reform are claiming that's exactly what the Knesset is trying to do. They're trying to so weaken the Supreme Court that there's not going to be any kind of check and balance on decisions made by the executive and legislative branch in Israel. If people are against it, why hasn't the government failed yet? For the government to fail, you'd have to have a no confidence vote. A no confidence vote would mean that you'd have a majority of people in the parliament that voted no confidence in the government. The governing coalition has 64 out of 120 seats. Therefore, they have a majority, and therefore they can hold on as long as they want. If the question that Bob is asking everybody here, or is asking me or everybody, why is the government not reacting to the demonstrations? That is a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. There has been one reaction. And we didn't get to this in the presentation, I'm sorry, it was my fault, but I want to hold to the time framework. Look, back in March, essentially what happened was the Minister of Defense was in the coalition, got cold feet because a lot of people in the reserves started threatening that if this reform is going to be passed, they're not going to show up for duty because they're basically the volunteers. And so he actually publicly said, maybe we should halt and get into a dialogue. And then the prime minister fired him, but didn't do it officially. He just did it verbally. He didn't send him a letter firing him. And then for 24 hours, the country was shut down by demonstrations, including the airport. There's a national strike. And Gallant, the Minister of Defense, was reinstated. I mean, he actually wasn't officially fired, so he was reinstated. And the government also called for a halt. And there was a halt in legislation from March until July. In July, it came back again with a vengeance, and we already had the first piece of legislation passed last week, as I mentioned. What right do governments and non-Israeli citizens participate? What right do governments and non-Israeli citizens participate in the protests in the U.S.? Choose justice. Okay. I'm going to answer what I understand to be the first question by Curtis. Okay. Very good question. If you are working in a public capacity, let's say in a government ministry, or you're working in a government institution, you'd have to get special permission to participate in the protests against the reform. And in fact, interestingly enough, the head of the Mossad, the present head of the Mossad, allowed the middle and lower rank members of the Mossad to demonstrate. But Israeli soldiers in uniform cannot, for example. Non-Israelis can demonstrate. Of course you can. Yeah, I mean, if you're a tourist and you're here and you can join a demonstration, there's nobody checking people's IDs or anything like that. What can be done to force a new election? Well, Rebecca, this is a democracy, and one or two things are going to happen. Either this government is going to collapse under its own weight, or we're going to have to wait 4 years for the next election. It's a democracy. Okay. Michael Eisner is telling me that the Jewish press ran a piece in March that said 78% of Israelis support reform. Well, Michael, let me send you to multiple websites, but I'll send you to one. The Israel Democracy Institute has been doing surveys. Go into the site and check out their surveys. I'm sorry, but the reality on the ground is that over 60% of Israelis are not supporting the reform, and all the public opinion surveys over the last few months have showed that if we had elections tomorrow morning, for whatever it's worth, this government would lose handily, would lose big time. Okay, and I'm sorry, but and by the way, I just gave you one example, but there are a whole slew of others. By the way, you can go into Israel Today, Israel Hayom, which is a specifically right-wing newspaper, which is funded by Miriam Edelson, used to be Sheldon and Miriam Edelson. Okay, they just published a public opinion survey about 3-4 days ago, which also talks about the fact that the majority is against it. And they are a pro-government newspaper, but they did a survey. Okay, if 65% of Israelis oppose the reforms, can't they be overturned after the time of the next election? Okay, Stuart asked this question. Theoretically, yes, the reforms, if they legislate reforms now, theoretically, you can, if you have election in 4 years' time, let's say the opposition takes, they can re-legislate the whole thing. That's correct. I think it's very important to understand another piece I didn't have time to present here, which is the following. It's not enough to look at the reforms. It's also important to look at the other bills that are being promoted right now. By end of March, there were 141 bills. I read all of them. Now there's even more than that. And when you start to read the bills, they give you a kind of roadmap of the intention, perhaps, of the coalition, potentially. One bill by a Likud lawmaker proposed that the largest party in the parliament should automatically get an extra 12 seats. So instead of being 120 seats, 132 seats. Another member of the Likud party proposed that instead of 4 years, it should be 5 years. Okay, so to lengthen their stay in the government. Okay, I can go on and on. You look at a lot of the bills that are being promoted that are not the reform, but they're adjacent to the reform. You start to get a good sense about where they want to go. What I'm trying to tell you is there are fears by some of the people who are demonstrating that down the road, by the way, the head of the election committee is a judge. That judge is appointed by the judiciary. One of the things they want to do is they want to have the politicians to appoint that. Okay, that's a slippery slope in terms of elections maybe not being so fair and transparent and equal. And the Israeli elections are considered to be some of the fairest and transparent and clear-cut elections you'll find in any democracies. Okay, what are the checks on the Supreme Court? Excellent question. First of all, the Supreme Court itself self-checks. Historically, in 75 years, has been very, very cautious and careful about exercising, for example, the standard of reasonableness and striking down. The Supreme Court has never struck down a basic law, never. Okay, Supreme Court has been very, very cautious and careful, not basically checking itself. Having said that, the question is a good one. The question is an excellent one. Supreme Court can't force. I mean, the Supreme Court can rule something. It ruled, for example, that the fact that ultra-Orthodox are not being conscripted into the army is unconstitutional. The government didn't do anything about it for 12 years. They kind of just ignored them. So in that sense, I think we can't overstate the power that the Supreme Court of Israel has. Okay, I think that would be really jumping too far. If what's underlying the question is, do we need a reform? In my opinion, in the opinion of probably 60 to 70% of Israelis, we need a reform, but the reform has to be across the board. We need a constitution. Okay, we need a reform that's really going to create proper checks and balances. And part of the reform is also to define very clearly what the powers of the judiciary are, for sure, and some of the things they've taken on themselves may need to be removed. But in the absence of a constitution, in the absence of other building blocks, if you just go with the reform, there are many people who feel that this would be the end of Israeli democracy, and that is what a lot of people are thinking of. Okay.
Avi, I'm just going to hop in. I know, but we gotta just say a couple of thank yous to you really quickly, and to everyone. I know we have 1 minute left, but I just want to make sure we're not going over time. I know we could hear and we have so many questions, but I just want to say thank you to you, Avi, for this program, and thank you all for being here. If you're interested in learning more with Avi, he has a free class on the Greek trip coming up next week. Andrea's going to talk to you more about that. I'll also just quickly say there's going to be a survey after this with the recording. We would love to hear your feedback. It'll take you 2 minutes tops to fill out the survey. It helps us figure out what programming you're interested in. So please make sure you fill that in. And the last thing that I want to say is that we are going to be launching a monthly series with Avi on general Israeli updates. Politics will be a part of that for sure, but also archaeology, culture, technology, everything that's happening in Israel. In September, October, and November, we're going to be having hour-long update sessions with Avi. The first one, it's not open for registration yet, but it will be soon, is on September 19th. So mark your calendars for that. Avi's going to be back for what's been going on in Israel on September 19th. I am going to turn this over really quickly to my colleague, Andrea, to take us out. Andrea?
And then give me 1 more second after you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adi and Avi. So I just want everyone quickly to know that Avi is not just an expert on Israeli politics, but also on Jewish history around the world. He is a master educator. I'm sure you all felt that today. He has a photographic memory, I have to tell you, because that is the truth. It's a remarkable thing about Avi, and one of our incredible partners in Melton Travel. So August the 9th, we have, which is next Thursday, at the same time, we're having our class about the Jews of Greece, 2,000 years of an incredible history. And this is a pre-learning session to our October trip. We really hope you can all join us. I will turn it back to Avi, but I'm going to post that link in the chat, and we can probably send it out after this class with our other information. And I've looked and seen all of my travel friends and all of our people here today. It was amazing to see all of you, and look forward to seeing you all again next Thursday. So thank you. Avi, to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Just one last thing, folks, something I wanted to talk about earlier, but I didn't. If you take a look over here, I have a new initiative. It's called Israel Studies Online. You can see my site over here. You may want to check it out. And come doing lectures online for communities and also in person. So check it out if you're interested. There's also an interesting free lecture on there about a different subject. And I'm looking forward to seeing hopefully all of you in our sessions coming out with Andrea. We really like to join us in Greece, in Dubai. We're going to be going to Morocco next year. We're talking about France is in the pipeline, Jewish France I'm talking about. There are a lot of things. And so stay tuned.
And Spain.
I hope you guys enjoyed this. And
we have Spain coming up too. That's a very popular trip. So hurry up and sign up for Spain because it's amazing. And Portugal goes together with Spain. So thanks, everybody. Adi, turning it over to you to say goodbye.
Yeah, I'm going to shut this bad boy down. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Andrea. And we hope to see you all at another Melton program soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Avi. That was fabulous.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Wonderful.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Take care, everyone.